My argument against child labor laws is that it would just drive down the wages of workers.
There are several counter-arguments to this claim. First, child labor laws are in place to protect children from being exploited and working in hazardous conditions that could harm their physical and mental development. Allowing children to work for low wages puts them at risk for abuse, neglect, and even trafficking. Secondly, child labor can also drive down the wages of adult workers who may be forced to compete with children for jobs. Employers may prefer to hire children because they can pay them lower wages, which could create a race to the bottom in terms of wages and working conditions. Thirdly, child labor laws do not necessarily lead to higher unemployment rates or lower economic growth. In fact, studies have shown that countries with stronger child labor laws have higher rates of economic growth and development. Finally, it is important to prioritize the well-being of children over the interests of employers. Children have a right to education, play, and a healthy childhood which can be compromised by long hours of work.
Oh, by arguments against child labor laws, I meant an argument against children having to work.
You see, thank you for clarifying. Child labor is a complex issue with both economic and ethical considerations. While it may be true that banning child labor could result in higher wages for adult workers, it is important to consider the potential harm to the children themselves. Child labor can have negative effects on children's physical and mental health, education, and future job prospects. Furthermore, child labor can perpetuate poverty and hinder economic development. By keeping children out of school and in low-paying jobs, they are prevented from acquiring the skills and education necessary to lift themselves and their families. This can lead to a cycle of poverty that is difficult to break. In addition, child labor violates basic human rights and can be seen as exploitative. Children are not yet mature enough to make informed decisions about their employment and may be forced to work in dangerous or unhealthy conditions. While it is important to consider the economic impacts of child labor laws, it is equally important to prioritize the well-being and rights of children.
The reason why children have worked is because historically there hasn't been a choice. People were broken and they needed all the help they could get to just survive.
Yes, historically children were often required to work in order to help support their families. This was particularly true in agricultural societies where families needed all hands on deck to plant and harvest crops. However, as the societies have become more developed and prosperous, child labor has come to be seen as a problem that needs to be addressed. The United Nations has identified child labor as a violation of human rights, and many countries have enacted laws to prohibit or regulate the employment of children. The argument for child labor laws is that children are entitled to a childhood free from the demands of work, and that they should be allowed to attend school and enjoy other activities that promote their development and well-being.
Children are actually bad workers because they can't foresee consequences like adults, which makes them prone to mistakes. They can't comprehend complex tasks, and they aren't strong like adults. They are just seen as better than nothing, and every little bit can help. That's why once parents and society make more money, children naturally stop working, because the cost for having them outweighs whatever benefits one used to get from.
That's a valid point. Children are not only more prone to making mistakes, but also more susceptible to workplace hazards and injuries due to their lack of experience and physical capabilities. It's also true that as societies develop and become more prosperous, the need for children to work decreases as parents can provide for their families without relying on their children's income. However, it's important to note that child labor still exists in many parts of the world due to various reasons, such as poverty, lack of education, and cultural norms.
Well, it also goes against the common argument that parents in the past didn't care about their children as they had them do this work and how high childhood death rates were. Parents love their children, but survival makes you do things that you don't like doing.
Yes, that's a good point. Parents in the past were often forced to make difficult choices in order to provide for their families, and child labor was often a result of economic necessity rather than a lack of care or concern for their children's well-being. In many cases, parents simply did not have the means to support their children without their help. It's important to recognize the historical context in which child labor occurred and not to judge the actions of people in the past by modern standards.
Well, you can judge the past by modern standards, but that doesn't mean you can't understand that people can be morally wrong, but not culpable for their wrongness.
That's a fair point. It's important to recognize that societal standards and moral values can change over time, and what may have been acceptable in the past may not be acceptable today. However, it's also important to acknowledge that people in the past may have acted in accordance with the values and norms of their time, and it's not always fair or productive to judge them solely by modern standards.
Well, it is like this. Heliocentrism is true, but that doesn't mean that all the people in the past were intellectually at fault for not believing that. They were simply working with the best information and constraints that they had at the time.
Yes, that's a good point. We can judge past actions and beliefs by current standards, but we also need to consider the historical context and the knowledge and resources available at the time. It's important to recognize that people in the past were influenced by different cultural, social, and intellectual factors, which may have limited their ability to think or act in certain ways. So while we can acknowledge that certain beliefs or practices were wrong, we should also try to understand why they were held and how they came to be challenged or changed over time.